What did Hierakonpolis reveal about Egypt's forgotten beginnings? The question echoes across the desert wind, stirring the dust of a land older than memory itself. Beneath layers of silt and time, the ruins whisper of a world before kings, before crowns, before the word Pharaoh had ever been spoken. Here in the cradle of the Nile, the first sparks of civilization flickered into life, fragile, brilliant, and utterly human. The stones do not boast, they murmur. The bones buried in the sand do not tell of conquest, but of becoming. Of a people learning to tame the flood, to carve order from chaos, to dream of eternity. Tonight we descend into that half-light between history and myth, where pottery shards speak more truth than scrolls, and every fragment of ivory or copper breathes the pulse of a vanished kingdom. We will follow the archaeologists' footprints, the silent prayers of the ancients, and the restless heartbeat of the river that made them gods. So close your eyes, let the hum of the Nile guide you, and step with me into the world before time had a name. Welcome to the Cryptic Realm channel, where forgotten worlds awaken. If you enjoy this journey, remember to subscribe, share, like, and leave your thoughts below. Every voice keeps history alive. The story begins not in gold or glory, but in mud, thick, fertile mud that the Nile left behind each season like a heartbeat from the earth itself. In that dark soil, life was reborn again and again, and from it rose the first whispers of a people who would one day build empires of stone. But before pyramids, before dynasties, before the faces of gods were carved into eternity, there was only the river and those who listened to it. Hierakonpolis, or Nekhen as the ancients called it, was not yet a city of kings. It was a settlement of farmers and craftsmen, of hunters who read the desert winds, of potters whose hands remembered the rhythm of the flood. To walk its ruins today is to walk through the silence before history began. Archaeologists came here not seeking treasure but truth. Beneath their brushes emerged fragments of a civilization that did not yet know its own name. The shards of painted pottery revealed more than decoration. They carried the earliest signs of social order, of belief, of imagination. A single vessel showing a boat with curved prows spoke of journeys, of trade along the river that linked scattered villages into a single current of life. Another shard, painted with figures of men and beasts, hinted at rituals that bound community to cosmos, a symbolic language long before hieroglyphs. Each discovery was like hearing the faint echo of a song written in clay. Hierakonpolis, around 4000 BCE, was already becoming something remarkable. Its people had learned to shape copper, rare and precious, into tools and ornaments that glowed like the desert sun. They tamed wild animals, brewed beer, and built workshops that pulsed with activity. The remains of kilns, stone tools, and pottery molds spoke of specialization, a word that in archaeology means progress, the dividing of labor that signals the birth of complexity. Yet this was not progress in the way we measure it now. It was an awakening, a gradual awareness that human hands could not only survive nature but collaborate with it. Among the most haunting discoveries at Hierakonpolis was a massive ceremonial enclosure, built of mudbrick and aligned with the rising sun. Within it, archaeologists found the remains of animal burials, elephants, baboons, leopards, laid to rest beside human graves. The meaning of this ritual remains elusive, but it suggests a world where the line between man and beast was sacred, not separate. The people of Hierakonpolis believed power flowed through life itself, and that to honor the creatures of the Nile was to honor creation. In the stillness of that sacred ground, the beginnings of divine kingship took root, not yet crowned but already imagined. Nearby lay a cemetery unlike any other of its time. The graves of ordinary villagers held simple offerings, beads, bowls, and tools, but some burials were different, larger, richer, with intricate pottery and imported goods. This was hierarchy taking form, a quiet revolution of the social fabric. One man was buried with a mace head carved in fine stone, a symbol that centuries later would become the emblem of the Pharaohs' might. He was not a king, but perhaps the memory of kingship began with him. In the careful arrangement of the dead, we see the living discovering the power of ritual, the need to define order, the first steps toward civilization's oldest promise, that life, through memory, could outlast death. The archaeologists called it Structure 6, a modest name for a monumental mystery. Its walls, though crumbled, still carry the imprint of human ambition. They are not the grand stones of Giza or the temples of Thebes, but they breathe with the same impulse. To build something that endures. As the sun set on the dig site, the light touched those ruins in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the past itself wished to be remembered. What Hierakonpolis revealed was not the sudden appearance of Egypt's greatness, but the long, patient rhythm of becoming. It showed a people learning to live not against the river, but with it. It showed faith taking shape in gesture and art, long before words could carry meaning. It showed that the idea of a god-king of divine order flowing through mortal hands did not appear from the void. It grew here among farmers, craftsmen, and dreamers who looked to the horizon and saw possibility. Yet questions linger like the shifting sands around the ruins. Who led these early people, and by what right? Were the first symbols of power born from devotion or from necessity? Did they imagine the first ruler as a protector or as a conduit to the divine? The answers remain buried beneath the centuries, waiting for the next turn of the trowel, the next gust of desert wind to uncover them. As night falls over the ancient city, the air hums with the same quiet pulse that once guided the flood. The Nile whispers, carrying with it the memory of a time when gods were young and men were still learning to build their world from earth and dream. The question drifts like a shadow across the water. If this was only the beginning, what more waited to be found farther down the river in the kingdoms yet unborn? The river never sleeps. Even when the stars drown in its black waters, it moves. Slow, eternal, patient. The Nile was more than a vein of life. It was memory itself, carving its story through time. Southward from Hierakonpolis, the land rose in waves of sandstone and silence, stretching toward the lands of Nubia. There, archaeologists traced the faint footprints of travelers and traders, those who once paddled their reed boats through the mist, carrying obsidian, ivory, and dreams between kingdoms unborn. Hierakonpolis was not an island of greatness. It was part of a current, a gathering of scattered sparks that would soon ignite into civilization. The people of the Nile did not build walls against the world. They built paths. The earliest settlements were open to the river's breath, and every home faced its rhythm. Each flood brought renewal but also danger. The water gave life yet could take it away without mercy. This cycle taught them something profound, that power was balance, not conquest. Their gods were not distant rulers but reflections of the forces they lived within. The sun that burned, the flood that healed, the earth that cradled. These were not yet the deities we know from temples and hieroglyphs, but their roots stretched deep here in the soil of survival and wonder. In the dim hollows of Hierakonpolis, archaeologists uncovered a small structure with walls painted in red, ochre, and black. The images were simple: boats, animals, men with raised arms, but their meaning was immense. This was one of the earliest sacred spaces known in Egypt, a place of worship long before pyramids pierced the sky. Its design carried a symmetry that echoed across millennia, the same order that would later guide temple builders at Karnak and Luxor. Here perhaps a priest or shaman once stood before a gathered crowd, invoking the unseen. The walls held no inscriptions, no divine names, but the art itself was a prayer, a declaration that meaning could be shaped, not only lived. Every excavation brought the same tension: science digging into myth. In the 1970s, Michael Hoffman and his team brushed centuries from bones and bricks, each discovery threading past to present. They found remnants of breweries, vats, jars, clay floors darkened by ancient yeast. Beer was not mere drink, it was communion, a symbol of abundance and connection. The workers of Hierakonpolis may have brewed not only to quench thirst, but to honor the gods who flooded their fields. In the rhythm of fermentation, they mirrored the river's pulse, transformation from chaos into sustenance, from grain to spirit. Civilization was fermenting too, quietly, beautifully beneath the sun. At the heart of the settlement lay evidence of workshops unlike any other of their age. Copper smelting, flint knapping, pottery firing, all were happening side by side. Smoke must have filled the air, mixing with the scent of clay and sweat. The hum of creation was constant. Such activity reveals something rare: organization. These people did not labor alone. They labored together, guided by unseen hands. Perhaps elders, perhaps chiefs, perhaps the first outlines of government. In their coordination, we glimpse the embryo of administration, a community learning that order could be made, not just found. Hierakonpolis's reach extended far beyond its mud-brick walls. Artifacts from distant lands, lapis from Afghanistan, shells from the Red Sea, have been unearthed in its soil. This was proof of contact, of a world already global in spirit, though primitive in means. Trade was not just exchange, it was dialogue. With each passing caravan, the people of Hierakonpolis learned new ways to see themselves. In the arrival of strangers, they found the idea of difference, and in difference, the birth of identity. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was not an object at all, but a body. In one grave, deeper and older than the rest, lay the remains of a man buried with reverence. Around him were fine jars, tools of copper, and a carved ivory figurine. His bones told of strength, his teeth of age. He was someone not by bloodline, but by the weight of memory others placed upon him. Was he a leader, a priest, or a visionary who first dreamt that humans could speak for the gods? No inscription names him, but the earth remembers the space he left behind. In him we meet the prototype of the Pharaoh, not a monarch of marble, but a man of flesh and dust who reached beyond his lifetime. When the team closed the site for the season, the desert reclaimed its silence. The winds brushed through the empty pits and the night crept in, cool and vast. Yet something had shifted. Hierakonpolis no longer felt like ruins. It felt alive, as though each grain of sand carried a pulse of ancient breath. The city had spoken, not in words but in rhythm. And so the story widens, flowing northward along the river's bend. For if Hierakonpolis was the heart, then other centers, Nakada, Abydos, and Buto, were its arteries, each carrying a different voice of the same awakening. What forces drew them together? What unseen hand guided their rise toward unity? The Nile flowed on, and somewhere in its shimmer lay the answer, waiting to be found beneath the weight of centuries. The Nile was never just a river. It was a timeline carved in water. As it flowed northward, it carried stories and of birth, of hunger, of the quiet persistence that binds generations. After Hierakonpolis, the current led toward another name that would echo through the ages, Nakada. To the untrained eye, Nakada might seem only a scattering of stones and sand. Yet beneath its dust lay the pulse of transformation. A world that was no longer content to live within the rhythm of the flood, but had begun to shape rhythm itself. Here something shifted in the human spirit. Nakada's people were artisans of memory. Their pottery was no longer purely practical. It was a canvas. Painted vessels bloomed with red and white spirals, with figures of hunters, dancers, and boats adorned with banners. The motif spoke not of survival, but of expression, of a people who began to see beauty as power. Archaeologists, brushing soil from these delicate forms, found themselves face to face with the first visual grammar of a civilization awakening to itself. The lines were bold, confident, suggestive of order and movement, as though the artists were not just decorating but recording, a prelude to writing. The cemeteries of Nakada told a quieter, darker story. Death was no longer only an end, it had become a stage. The graves grew deeper, the offerings richer. Some were furnished with stone pallets shaped like birds or shields, their surfaces worn by the grinding of malachite into green pigment, the color of rebirth. Others held combs of ivory, bracelets of shell, and small figurines of women with wide hips and serene faces. These were not random trinkets. They were symbols of fertility, continuity, and the eternal return of life. The people of Nakada had begun to weave death into meaning, building the emotional foundation for what would later become the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife. Beneath their hands, the world itself seemed to organize. Settlements grew larger, more complex. Workshops turned into districts, dwellings clustered into neighborhoods. Pottery and tools once made for a family were now made for trade. There was wealth, not in gold, but in skill, in the ability to craft what others desired. And where wealth gathers, so too does inequality. In the contrast between rich and poor graves, we see the first tension between the many and the few. Hierarchy had taken root, not by decree but by accumulation. It was a fragile balance, and it would soon demand protection, leadership, vision. The Nakada culture expanded its influence across the Nile Valley, spreading motifs, materials, and beliefs. Yet influence is never one way. From the deserts to the east came traders bearing copper and precious stones. From the west, nomads brought herds and knowledge of distant oases. These encounters enriched the Nile people, but also changed them. The boundaries of culture began to blur, and out of that blending emerged a new sense of identity, not of village, but of nation. A collective consciousness was forming like clay pressed into shape by unseen hands. Among the ruins, archaeologists found evidence of conflict. Burned layers in the earth, broken weapons, and fortifications of mudbrick. Peace had given way to competition. As the Nile connected more communities, it also set them against one another. To control the river was to control life itself. Power began to concentrate, and in the swirl of ambition, the outlines of kingship took form. Some scholars see in this the first stirrings of the state, a society learning that authority could unify what the flood divided. Yet even amid struggle, artistry flourished. The craftsmen of Nakada shaped figurines so detailed that one could almost feel their breath. They carved boats onto pallets, not as simple vessels but as symbols of journey. Between worlds, between life and death, between the known and the divine. The boat would become one of Egypt's most enduring metaphors, later carrying the sun god Ra across the sky each day. But here, in Nakada, it was still the dream of a people who found transcendence in motion. The archaeologists could only guess what songs these people sang, what prayers they whispered to the river, what stories they told their children as the night winds passed over the desert. Yet their silence spoke loudly. In the care with which they shaped a pot, in the patience with which they buried their dead, in the patterns of their settlements, there was intention, the earliest architecture of thought. Nakada was not yet a kingdom, but it was a seed, and every gesture carried the DNA of empire. As the centuries drifted on, the Nakada culture would merge, expand, and evolve into something grander. The pre-dynastic civilization that paved the way for pharaohs. But before crowns and monuments, before the language of gods was written on temple walls, there was this. A community of dreamers along the Nile, painting their beliefs into clay, turning ritual into art and art into the memory of a nation unborn. The desert still holds their colors, faded but not lost, waiting for the light to fall just right upon them. And so, as the wind sighs over the old burial fields, one cannot help but wonder. What force guided these early people to imagine eternity long before they could name it? What unseen truth stirred within them, calling them to build a world that would never truly die? Night settles over the valley, and the Nile glimmers like molten glass beneath the stars. Somewhere beyond the dunes, fires once burned in small encampments, flickering against the dark. It is here, between the silence of the desert and the rhythm of the flood, that another story begins to surface. The story of Abydos. Long before it became a royal necropolis, before Osiris was worshipped as lord of the underworld, Abydos was a city of beginnings, not endings. Its sands guard the pulse of the first organized state, a place where memory became monument and the will to remember became a kind of divinity. When archaeologists first cut through the dry soil at el-Kab, the ancient burial ground of Abydos, they did not expect to find the outline of a nation's birth. Yet beneath the layers of time, they uncovered graves unlike any seen before. The pits were deep, lined with mudbrick, filled with pottery, stone vessels, and offerings arranged in solemn order. In some lay human remains surrounded by those of servants, sacrificed to accompany their master into eternity. The discovery startled the modern world. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was devotion taken to its most absolute form. The belief that one could serve beyond death, that loyalty might transcend the boundaries of flesh, was already taking root in the Egyptian heart. Each burial was not an act of mourning, but of construction, the building of a cosmology. The tomb became a microcosm of the world, the eastern walls painted to face the sunrise, the western to greet the realm of the dead. In that arrangement was philosophy, though unspoken. The idea that life was a passage, not an end. Long before papyrus scrolls recorded theology, the people of Abydos were shaping faith in the language of earth and orientation. Archaeologists trace these graves to the rulers of what they called Dynasty Zero, the shadow line between prehistory and history. Among them was a name carved into ivory and clay, a sign both simple and majestic, the Scorpion. The Scorpion King, as he is now called, ruled before writing could tell his deeds, yet his symbols speak clearly. On ceremonial mace heads found at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, his figure stands tall, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Before Narmer united the two lands, the Scorpion King may have dreamed of it. The vision of one river, one people, one destiny. Abydos thus became more than a city. It was a mirror of aspiration. Around its burial grounds rose workshops, shrines, and homes. Potters shaped vessels to hold the essence of life, grain, oil, wine. Stone carvers etched the first tentative hieroglyphs, marks of ownership that soon became the alphabet of eternity. With every stroke of a reed brush, abstraction gave birth to permanence. Words were being born, and with them the possibility of history. The landscape of Abydos was sacred long before temples were raised. The cliffs behind the cemeteries rose like watchful sentinels, their ridges catching the dawn. To the people who lived there, this horizon was a threshold, the place where the sun entered and left the world. It was not coincidence that their dead faced westward. They believed the soul would follow the sun, crossing through night to rise again. This faith in renewal, so integral to Egypt's later religion, had already taken its first breath in the dust of Abydos. Among the relics uncovered were palettes carved with scenes of conquest. Armies advancing, standards raised, captives bound. Power was no longer symbolic, it was political. The rulers of Abydos had begun to imagine authority not merely as divine blessing but as inheritance, something that could be passed from one generation to the next. Kingship was solidifying, given shape through ritual and blood. The tomb was its manifesto declaring, "I ruled, therefore I remain." Yet beneath the grandeur, the humanity of these people lingers. In one burial, a small clay figurine of a woman cradling a child was found beside a noble's body. No one knows her name or role, only that someone placed her there, a gesture of tenderness amid ceremony. Such moments reveal the contradiction at the heart of early Egypt. A civilization reaching for eternity, yet still profoundly human, still afraid of loss. When the archaeologists stood at the edge of the royal tombs, the desert wind howled through the open pits, carrying sand like whispers. It felt as though the dead were still speaking, not of glory, but of continuity. Abydos was teaching them that civilization is not built on conquest alone. It endures through remembrance. The Egyptians would later call their word for tomb Perjet, the house of eternity. That idea was born here under these stars, in the humility of clay and the grandeur of belief. As the moon rose above the cliffs, casting long shadows over the excavations, one question refused to fade. How did these early rulers convince others to follow them beyond life itself? Was it faith, fear, or the unspoken promise that to serve a king was to share in his immortality? The answers lie buried still, but in the hush of the desert night, one truth becomes clear. Abydos was not the end of a story, but the heartbeat that would carry Egypt toward unity, toward empire, toward forever. Dawn crept slowly over the desert, turning the limestone cliffs of Abydos a pale, ghostly gold. The air shimmered with that strange stillness that belongs only to sacred places, where every grain of sand seems to hold its breath. The archaeologists who camped nearby often spoke of it, that uncanny quiet before the sun rose high, when it felt as if the earth remembered. From this land of silence, the pulse of Egypt began to move northward, toward the wide delta and the dream of unification. The river became the messenger, carrying not just silt and seed, but symbols. The icons of power, the language of gods, and the memory of kings who had not yet been crowned. The story that the Nile now told was one of convergence. Along its banks, the scattered centers of Nakada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis were no longer isolated sparks, but glowing embers feeding the same flame. Pottery styles became uniform. Burial customs echoed one another, and the same motifs. Boats, standards, animals in procession appeared in villages hundreds of kilometers apart. Unity was no longer an accident. It was a movement. Somewhere in the shifting sands between Thebes and Nekhen, the idea of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, began to form. But the path to unity was not peace. Beneath the harmony of art lay the tremor of conflict. Excavations at Hierakonpolis revealed walls that had been burned, bones marked by weapons. Fragments of shields scattered like forgotten prayers. Farther north, the ruins of Buto and Madi bore the same scars. Egypt's birth was not gentle. It came through rivalry, through the struggle of regions learning to bow before a single horizon. Each settlement had its leader, its emblem carved on pottery or ivory. A falcon, a scorpion, a bull. These were not mere totems. They were identities, banners of belonging in a world still learning what nationhood meant. Among these emblems, one would rise above the rest. The falcon, the bird of the sky, the watchful predator, became the symbol of dominion. Its image spread like the flight it represented, appearing on pallets, mace heads, and ivory tags. The falcon was the mark of Horus, though the name may not yet have been spoken. In its fierce gaze, the Egyptians saw something eternal, the union of heaven and earth, the watcher who ruled both. Later kings would call themselves Horus in life, and their enemies those beneath the talon. Yet here, at the dawn of that belief, the falcon was simply the dream of transcendence made visible. The Narmer palette, found centuries later in Hierakonpolis, would tell the culmination of this dream. Carved in gray-green slate, it shows a ruler wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, smiting his foes while the falcon hovers above, clutching the head of a bound captive. Scholars see in it the first historical record of unification. The moment myth met reality. But what came before that victory? What allowed one man to rise above the rest, to turn scattered chiefdoms into a kingdom? The clues lie not only in battle but in belief. The people of the Nile had come to understand power as sacred. To lead was not merely to command, it was to maintain Mat, the balance of the universe. Though the word itself would emerge later, the principle already existed. Flood and drought, life and death, order and chaos, all had to be held in harmony. The early rulers were more than chieftains, they were mediators between worlds. Their legitimacy flowed from their ability to keep the rhythm steady, to ensure that the river rose and the fields bloomed. In that fragile equilibrium, politics became theology. The pharaohs had not yet been born, but the idea of kingship as cosmic duty was already taking shape. As communities merged, so too did their rituals. Festivals honoring the river, the hunt, or the harvest became shared events that bound the people beyond bloodlines. Music, dance, and the intoxicating scent of beer carried through the night, weaving human joy with divine gratitude. These were not primitive celebrations, they were rehearsals for religion. In the flickering firelight, masks and chants blurred the boundary between mortal and God. A performer painted in ochre might embody the falcon, another the lioness or the serpent, early reflections of deities that would one day rule the Egyptian pantheon. Through ritual, they became what they revered. Trade flourished as well, carried by boats that glided silently through the morning mist. Copper from Sinai, incense from Punt, and lapis from distant mountains all found their way into Egypt's hands. Wealth grew, but more importantly, so did imagination. To trade was to dream of what lay beyond the horizon. And in dreaming outward, the people began to look inward, to define what it meant to be of the Nile, of this land shaped by water and sun. By the time the first dynasty rose, the pattern was set. The Nile was no longer a chain of villages. It was a single breath drawn by many lungs. The seeds of empire had sprouted in the mud left behind by the floods of countless generations. But with unity came a question that would haunt every ruler who followed. Could the order they built endure the chaos they feared? Could Mat outlast ambition? As the sun climbed higher, washing the cliffs of Abydos in blinding light, the river shimmered like a mirror of time. In its depths slept the reflections of all who had lived and died along its banks. The wind whispered over the water as if to remind them, power too is a current. It flows, it turns, and it always returns to the source. What would the next tide bring? What vision would rise from the river's heart to shape the destiny of a kingdom not yet born? The wind across the Nile that morning carried a strange stillness, as though the land itself waited to exhale. The river gleamed beneath a rising sun, its surface smooth and deceptive, calm above, restless below. Somewhere between Abydos and the delta, time was changing its rhythm. The tribes and chiefdoms that had once competed for land and water were no longer isolated powers. They were drawn toward one another by the slow gravity of necessity, the need for order, for coordination, for something larger than themselves. From this quiet convergence, history was about to take form. At the heart of this transformation stood a name carved into legend: Narmer. His was not the first, but it would be the one that endured. Archaeologists, piecing together the fragments of his life, found evidence not only of conquest, but of vision. On a small ivory seal from Abydos, his name appears beside the sign of a catfish and a chisel, symbols that would one day become royal titles. On the famous Narmer pallet, he stands poised, arm raised, about to strike a kneeling captive, while above him the falcon god hovers, clutching the heads of 6 bound enemies. To modernize, the scene is brutal. To ancient ones, it was divine. The image did not celebrate violence but cosmic order, the triumph of unity over chaos, of the river made whole. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was not a single event. It was a process written across generations. Narmer may have been its final chord, but the melody began long before him, carried in trade, in marriage, in the shared symbols painted on pottery and carved into stone. Each exchange between villages blurred a boundary. Each victory or alliance stitched together what had once been apart. The 2 lands, Upper Egypt's long narrow valley and Lower Egypt's sprawling delta, became not rivals but reflections of each other. Where the south offered stone, the north offered grain. Where one held the sun, the other the sea. To unite them was to balance the world. In the sands near Hierakonpolis, archaeologists uncovered the remains of what they believed to be a palace facade. Mudbrick walls patterned with niches and recesses that would later inspire temple architecture. The design was both defensive and ceremonial, suggesting that kingship had already become a spectacle. Power was now meant to be seen, its architecture a language of legitimacy. Within these walls, early rulers held audiences, distributed goods, and received tribute from distant regions. The palace was a theater of order, its rituals echoing the rhythm of the river, giving, taking, renewing. Alongside this new grandeur came the rise of writing. Small tags of ivory and bone, used to label jars or record deliveries, bear the earliest known hieroglyphs. They were not yet sentences but symbols, condensed ideas born of necessity. A falcon meant a ruler, a fish a region, a wave the flow of the Nile. Each mark captured a fragment of meaning, binding thought to permanence. To inscribe was to control time. It allowed the present to speak to the future. In that act, kingship gained immortality. Narmer's name could travel farther than his voice, endure longer than his reign. The unification also transformed belief. The falcon god Horus emerged as the protector of kings, the living embodiment of sovereignty. To wear the crown was to channel divine force. The king was not simply chosen by the gods. He was the god in flesh, his authority sanctified by the very act of breathing. This merging of human and divine was revolutionary. It bound the political to the cosmic and made rebellion not just a crime, but a sin against the universe. Order, once local and fragile, became sacred law. But power has its price, and its architecture requires labor. Thousands toiled to build the early capitals, Thinis, perhaps, or Memphis, where the 2 lands met. Villages became towns, towns became cities. Bureaucracies began to sprout, recorded on tablets of clay and lists of offerings. Grain was measured, herds were counted, temples were supplied. Egypt had discovered administration, and with it came permanence. The ability to manage the rhythm of plenty and scarcity. The flood could no longer dictate fate. The state could. Still, beneath the stone and ceremony there lingered something tender, the human face of transformation. In one small grave at Abydos, a child was buried with a necklace of shell beads, her tiny bones arranged carefully, lovingly. Around her, archaeologists found the footprints of those who had come to mourn. They were not rulers, not priests, just people standing at the threshold of a new world. bringing their grief into a landscape that was learning to monumentalize memory. Civilization was being built not only through conquest and craft, but through emotion. The desire to hold on to what time would take away. By the end of Narmer's reign, the horizon of Egypt had changed forever. The falcon's wings stretched from the first cataract in the south to the edge of the Mediterranean in the north. A single crown now symbolized both lands. The tall white hedget of Upper Egypt joined with the red deshret of Lower Egypt, forming the double crown that would gleam on the heads of pharaohs for 3,000 years. It was more than an emblem. It was a statement that balance had been achieved. Yet as the river flowed on, eternal and indifferent, one could almost sense the questions it carried. How long could unity endure before ambition fractured it again? Could human order ever match the precision of the flood? In the shimmer of the Nile's surface, the reflection of a new kingdom trembled. Bright, fragile, magnificent, waiting to see if it could survive its own birth. The river widened as it neared the delta, where the reeds whispered secrets to the wind and the horizon dissolved into endless marsh. Here, where water and sky met without boundary, the first unified Egypt began to take shape under the reign of Narmer's successors. The kingdom was no longer an idea. It had become geography, a body with arteries of trade and veins of irrigation, its pulse measured by the flood. And at its heart, somewhere between the sand and the sea, the city of Memphis began to rise. The first true capital of a land newly aware of its own eternity. Memphis, called Eneb-Hej, the White Walls, was born of both politics and faith. Its placement was symbolic, the meeting point between Upper and Lower Egypt, between desert and delta, between order and chaos. The pharaoh's court settled there not by chance, but by philosophy. It was the center of balance. To govern Egypt was to govern duality itself, and Memphis stood as the hinge between the two lands. From this city of limestone and clay, the king's voice carried down the Nile, commanding the farthest quarries and the most distant farms, binding them to one rhythm. The landscape was alive with motion. Boats glided across the canals, their sails swelling like the breath of gods. Farmers worked the fields in the glow of early morning, their feet sinking into the black soil. Artisans hammered copper, carved ivory, and baked the clay that would line the storage houses of the king. The sound of civilization was not silence, it was rhythm. The synchronized hum of human hands building permanence. Yet Memphis was more than function. It was dream turned to architecture. Around its palaces and workshops, temples began to rise, their walls adorned with reliefs of the king offering to the gods, the eternal cycle of giving and receiving. Among the deities of early Memphis stood one whose presence would come to define Egyptian thought. Ptah, the creator. Unlike the sun god Ra, who burned and blazed, Ptah created by word and thought. He spoke the world into being. In his temple, priests whispered the oldest theology we know, that creation was not violence but speech, not chaos subdued but intention made real. For the rulers of Memphis, this was revelation. Power no longer depended on the sword or the flood. It rested on order, language, and design, the same forces that would guide Egypt for millennia. The city itself became an expression of Ptah's doctrine, thought manifested in stone. Archaeologists found evidence of large administrative complexes, rooms filled with seal impressions, jars labeled with hieroglyphs that now flowed easily, no longer tentative scratches but confident strokes. The bureaucracy of Memphis was a machine of memory. Every measure of grain, every shipment of copper or linen was recorded. The scribes, seated cross-legged in the shade, turned data into divinity. In their ink, numbers and names gained immortality. They were the quiet architects of empire, giving structure to what the flood would otherwise erase. But for all its order, the city hummed with mystery. Excavations near Saqqara, on the western edge of Memphis, revealed tombs that belonged not to kings but to officials, high priests, architects, administrators. Their walls were carved with scenes of daily life: cattle herding, fishing, banquets, music. These were not monuments of power but of gratitude. They show that by the dawn of the first dynasty, Egyptians no longer saw eternity as the privilege of rulers alone. The afterlife was becoming democratic, not in equality but in aspiration. The kingdom's greatness was reflected in the belief that every human gesture could reach the divine if performed with devotion. Beneath the tombs, shafts plunged into darkness, leading to burial chambers lined with wood and stone. Offerings of bread, beer, and oil still rested in their niches after 5,000 years, preserved by the dry air. The scent of cedar lingered faintly, imported from Lebanon, carried across deserts and seas. Trade and faith had intertwined completely. To build a tomb in Memphis was to participate in the cosmic order, to prepare one's place in the eternal architecture of the Nile. Life above the ground mirrored death below it. The same principles guided both: symmetry, harmony, precision. Artisans sculpted miniature boats and models of servants to accompany the dead, ensuring that their journey would mirror the life they once lived. Each act of creation was a conversation with time, a way to outwit oblivion. Even the humblest worker understood that his labor touched eternity. The potter shaping a jar for grain was also shaping a vessel for memory. As the sun set behind the western cliffs, the city glowed beneath a haze of dust and light. Smoke from hearths rose into the orange sky, blending with the shimmer of the floodplain. Somewhere a priest's chant echoed through the temple of Ptah, his words lost to time but his purpose eternal: to keep the world in balance. Memphis had become the first expression of the Pharaohs' true power. Not domination, but endurance. It was a city built not only to rule but to remember. And yet beneath its white walls new questions stirred, like the undercurrent of the Nile. Could the equilibrium it embodied truly last? Would the gods remain silent witnesses to human order, or demand a new kind of devotion? As the stars emerged over the horizon and the river sighed against its banks, one could almost hear the murmur of the coming ages, the rise of dynasties, the birth of monuments, and the first dream of a mountain of stone that would pierce the sky. Night descended over Memphis, and the stars gathered above the floodplain, like scattered embers of forgotten gods. The city slept, but the river did not. It whispered through the darkness, carrying silt and starlight, stories and sorrow. In its reflection, the twin crowns of Egypt glimmered faintly, the red and the white, symbols of unity, balance, and the promise that chaos had been subdued. But in truth, chaos was never gone. It merely slept beneath the surface, waiting for its turn to rise. For every empire that dreams of eternity, there comes a moment when it must prove worthy of its own legend. The early kings who followed Narmer, Jarden, lived in the shadow of creation. They were not just rulers. They were heirs to the impossible. To maintain the order Narmer had forged was as difficult as to create it. The flood could destroy as easily as it could nourish, and the loyalty of distant provinces ebbed and flowed like the river itself. Yet these kings did not rule by fear alone. They built by faith, in themselves, in their gods, and in the structure that bound both. The first dynasty became a laboratory of kingship, a time when divine order was not yet assured but constantly rehearsed. The successor of Narmer expanded the realm's reach southward, securing the borderlands and the trade routes that fed Egypt's hunger for copper, gold, and exotic goods. He built temples to honor the gods of both lands, a gesture of unity and diplomacy wrapped in devotion. In his reign, the pharaoh's role as high priest solidified. The king was not merely the ruler of men, but the mediator between heaven and earth, performing the rituals that kept the cosmos in motion. Every offering, every sacrifice was a reenactment of creation, an act meant to keep chaos at bay. To rule Egypt was not a privilege, it was an act of maintenance. In the royal cemeteries of Abydos, Aha's tomb stood among those of his ancestors. A vast complex of chambers and courtyards, its walls once painted and adorned with offerings. Surrounding it were smaller graves, perhaps those of attendants or servants who followed their king into eternity. The practice of retainer sacrifice, grim as it seems, was part of a logic that saw the afterlife as an extension of earthly duty. To die for the king was to share in his eternal life, to pass from time into myth. These burials, silent and symmetrical, speak of a world that viewed death not as loss, but as relocation, from the realm of dust to the realm of divine order. By the reign of Den, the fifth king of the first dynasty, Egypt had matured into something formidable. His name appears on ivory labels, his image carved into stone. He is shown wearing the double crown, the first ruler depicted this way, striking down enemies before the god Horus. Yet his achievements went beyond warfare. Under Den, the machinery of state reached a new sophistication. The court grew, administration expanded, and the king's presence extended into every province. Roads were built, taxes collected, temples endowed. In his tomb, archaeologists found sandals gilded with gold, not a sign of vanity but of symbolism. The king walked upon sacred ground, even his steps were divine. The tombs themselves tell the story of evolution. What began as simple pits in the sand had become elaborate constructions. Wooden chambers reinforced with brick, lined with precious goods, sealed against time. The idea of eternity had found its architecture. It was here that the concept of the mastaba emerged, a flat-roofed rectangular structure that would become the model for all royal tombs to follow. In these shapes lay the seed of something far greater, something that would rise centuries later in stone and shadow, the pyramids. But for now, these early tombs were statements of permanence, of defiance against decay. Beyond the realm of kings, everyday life along the Nile thrived. Farmers harvested barley, brewed beer, and stored grain in cylindrical silos that stood like silent guardians over the village. potters molded vessels with practiced hands, their designs echoing patterns that had endured for generations. In workshops near Memphis, craftsmen fashioned ivory combs, stone jars, and inlaid ornaments, not luxuries but necessities for both life and afterlife. Women wove linen so fine it shimmered like river mist, used for clothing, wrappings, and ritual. Every gesture of their labor was tied to the rhythm of belief that the world could only remain stable if each person performed their part in the great cosmic order. Religion and reality had become indistinguishable. The gods no longer hovered at the edges of imagination. They had entered daily life. In the morning, offerings of bread and beer were placed before the household shrines. At noon, priests in temples reenacted the myths of creation, invoking the breath of Ptah, the tears of Isis, the gaze of Horus. As night fell, the people looked to the stars and saw not constellations, but the souls of kings sailing across the sky in their celestial boats. To them, the heavens were not distant, they were home. And yet, even as Egypt found its rhythm, the questions deepened. How long could a single ruler sustain the weight of cosmic responsibility? Could human hands truly uphold divine balance? Or was the Nile itself the only true monarch of this land? The river flowed on, reflecting moonlight and mystery, carrying the faint echoes of prayers from Memphis to Abydos, from the living to the dead. And in that whispering current lay the promise that the dream of eternity would soon take form, not in words or wood, but in the stone that would outlast them all. The dawn light spilled across the western desert, painting the limestone ridges in shades of rose and gold. The wind moved softly, as if careful not to disturb the silence of the dead. Beneath that quiet expanse, the kings of Egypt slept. Aha, Jer, Den, and those whose names had already crumbled into dust. Their tombs at Abydos were no longer the resting places of individuals. They had become symbols, anchors for the living to remember the divine pattern that sustained the world. Yet the sands were shifting, and the next generation of rulers looked northward. The horizon of eternity was expanding, and the architecture of remembrance was about to change forever. At Saqqara, not far from Memphis, the necropolis stretched toward the desert edge, a city of the dead mirroring the city of the living. Here, the tombs of high officials and nobles had begun to grow in complexity, each one a statement of devotion and ambition. The mastaba, that rectangular mound of brick rising above the sands, was no longer just a grave. It had become an interface between worlds, a threshold through which the living could speak to the departed and offer sustenance through ritual. Its walls were smooth, its chambers painted with scenes of life so vivid they seemed to breathe. Cattle were herded in long processions, bakers kneaded dough, fishermen cast nets, all to ensure that these acts would continue eternally in the realm beyond. But what began as imitation soon turned into innovation. One of the great architects of the early Second Dynasty imagined something bolder, a structure that did not hide within the sand but reached toward the sky. His name is lost, but his idea endured. To stack mastabas one atop another as if climbing toward the heavens. The concept would sleep for a generation before awakening in the mind of a man named Imhotep, who would give it the form of stone. Yet even before his genius, the dream had already begun to stir. Egypt was learning to build upward, to sculpt permanence in vertical form, to make architecture a gesture of faith. The rulers of the second dynasty faced challenges unlike their predecessors. Unity so hard won under Narmer and his heirs began to tremble under the strain of distance and division. The dual nature of Egypt, upper and lower, desert and delta, remained a source of both strength and tension. Inscriptions hint at conflicts between the two regions, at rival courts that claimed legitimacy in the names of different gods. Some scholars believe the kingdom may even have split briefly, each ruler governing his own half of the sacred land. Yet the remarkable thing is not the division but the endurance. Egypt did not collapse, it adapted. The idea of Mat, the balance of all things, had become too deeply woven into the people's consciousness to be undone by politics. The kings of this era turned inward, focusing on the machinery of faith and governance. Temples multiplied along the riverbanks, dedicated to gods who had grown more distinct: Horus, Hathor, Seth, Neith. Each deity embodied a force of nature or emotion. Each reflected the people's need to explain the rhythm of life. In the temples, priests developed calendars based on the stars and the flood cycle, measuring time not as chaos but as pattern. The stars of Orion and Sirius became markers of divine order, their rising and setting guiding both ritual and harvest. Astronomy was not science here. It was theology written in light. The bureaucracy, too, expanded. Officials recorded taxes, managed granaries, and supervised the construction of temples and tombs. Their titles: overseer of the fields, controller of offerings, chief of scribes, echo through the centuries as the earliest expressions of organized government. Egypt was becoming a state not merely ruled by kings but run by a system, a living machine designed to perpetuate Ma'at. And though the pharaoh remained the embodiment of this balance, the machinery ensured that the rhythm would continue even as kings rose and fell. In Saqqara, one nobleman's mastaba stood out from the rest. Its walls bore not only scenes of daily life but lines of carved symbols that scholars recognize as the earliest funerary texts, simple prayers and invocations meant to protect the soul on its journey. In those lines lay the seeds of something vast, the idea that words themselves could bridge the divide between life and death. Centuries later, these invocations would grow into the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings known to humankind. But here in the quiet sand of Saqqara they were whispers, soft, uncertain, profoundly human. The artisans who carved these prayers worked by torchlight, their hands steady, their breath shallow as they chiseled eternity into stone. They could not have known that their craft would outlast dynasties, that their hieroglyphs would one day be read again after millennia of silence. They carved not for glory but for assurance, that their kings and patrons would live forever in the cycle of the sun. Every stroke was an act of faith against forgetting. As the sun set over Saqqara, its rays caught the flat tops of the mastabas, turning them to gold. The desert seemed to shimmer with memory. The Nile far below flowed on, patient, eternal, indifferent. Egypt had learned to speak through architecture, to build its theology into the bones of the earth. Yet the true expression of that faith had not yet risen. It waited still, hidden in the mind of a man who believed stone could be shaped into eternity. What would happen when that idea took form? What would Egypt become when its kings began to build not for death but for forever? The desert shimmered beneath the midday sun, a vast expanse of gold and silence stretching beyond sight. Somewhere on that horizon, a single shadow began to rise, the shadow of a monument that would change the course of history. It was not born of conquest or whim, but of vision. The age of mudbrick had ended. The age of stone had begun. Egypt was about to speak not in words or clay, but in geometry. In the third dynasty, a new ruler ascended the throne, Djoser, a name that would echo through eternity. He inherited a land at peace, unified, prosperous, and bound by ritual. Yet prosperity brings its own hunger, the hunger to outlast. Djoser sought to build not merely a tomb, but a statement. That kingship itself was divine architecture. His chief architect was a man unlike any before him, a genius whose name would be remembered as both builder and philosopher, Imhotep. To him, Djoser entrusted a dream that seemed impossible, to transform the idea of eternity into something the world could see. The site chosen was Saqqara, already sacred, already crowded with the tombs of nobles and ancestors. Here Imhotep conceived something new, a tomb that rose, not sank. He began with a mastaba, the traditional house of the dead, but refused to stop there. Instead, he built upward, adding layer upon layer until the structure took on the shape of a staircase to the heavens. 6 tiers, each smaller than the one below, climbing toward the sky like the steps of creation itself. The step pyramid of Djoser was born, and with it the first monument in history built entirely of stone. The builders worked with precision that still defies imagination. Thousands of laborers carved limestone blocks, each one fitted by hand without mortar. The sound of chisels rang across the desert, a rhythm of creation that matched the pulse of the Nile. Dust rose like incense, days melted into years, and the pyramid grew, shimmering under the sun as if the gods themselves had laid their hands upon it. Around it, Imhotep constructed an entire complex, courtyards, shrines, colonnades, and temples, all aligned with celestial order. It was not a tomb alone. It was a city of eternity, where the king could continue his rituals in death as in life. Inside, corridors twisted like veins through the stone, lined with blue-green tiles that mimicked the reeds of the Nile. At the center lay the burial chamber, sealed with granite, meant never to be opened again. Here Djoser would rest, his body wrapped in linen, his name inscribed in gold. But the pyramid was more than a house for the dead. It was a declaration that the pharaoh had become more than human. His soul, the Ka, would ascend those stone steps and join the sun's eternal voyage. For the first time, architecture itself became theology. Imhotep's brilliance reshaped Egypt's understanding of the sacred. He was not merely an engineer, but a philosopher of matter. He saw stone as the language of permanence, the earth's memory molded into form. Later generations would revere him as a god of wisdom and healing. But his true miracle was this: he gave eternity a structure. Every pyramid that followed, every temple, every monument that stood against the wind for millennia was born from his vision. The step pyramid became a beacon visible for miles. Pilgrims and priests came to offer tribute, to stand in its shadow and feel the weight of divine order made real. Its gleaming white limestone casing caught the light of dawn and dusk, turning it into a living symbol of rebirth. Even now, when the casing is gone and its surface scarred by time, the pyramid breathes. each block a heartbeat, each shadow a prayer. In the years that followed, Djoser's successors sought to match his glory. At Medum and Djoser, other pyramids rose, some collapsing, others standing, each one a conversation between ambition and gravity. The architects experimented with angles, materials, and techniques, slowly learning the secrets that would culminate in perfection centuries later at Giza. But every stone laid after Djoser carried Imhotep's whisper. The sky is not unreachable. The impact of this moment rippled through all of Egypt. For the people, the step pyramid was proof that their ruler truly bridged the worlds. To live under a pharaoh was to live under a being who could command stone to rise and shadow to obey. For artisans, it was the dawn of mastery. Proof that human hands could defy decay. For priests, it was revelation. That worship could be built. That divinity could inhabit design. At sunset, when the long shadow of the pyramid stretched across the sands, it touched the smaller tombs of those who built it. Their names were not recorded, yet their work endures more surely than any throne. In their sweat and skill, they too achieved immortality. The monument did not belong to Djoser alone, it belonged to them all, a collective act of faith made tangible. As twilight deepened and stars began to bloom across the desert sky, the pyramid glowed faintly in the starlight, its edges soft, its presence eternal. Egypt had crossed a threshold. The divine was no longer distant, it stood upon the earth built by human hands. And as the wind swept through the silent courtyards of Saqqara, one could almost hear the question that would echo for ages. If man could build forever, what then was the difference between mortal and God? The wind around Saqqara carried the scent of dust and eternity. The step pyramid stood motionless beneath the pale sky, its tears glowing faintly in the morning light, like the bones of a dream made real. Imhotep's masterpiece had reshaped Egypt's imagination. The people no longer looked only to the river for life. They looked to the horizon, to stone, to the heavens. The land that had once been bound by mud and flood now spoke the language of architecture and divinity. But as Djoser's monument stood finished, casting its long shadow over the desert, a new question arose in the hearts of kings and builders alike. If stone could reach eternity, how much higher could it climb? The successors of Djoser, eager to leave their own mark upon the world, continued to chase that question. The next great experiment began under King Sneferu, whose name would one day be spoken with awe by every mason of the Nile. Sneferu inherited more than a throne. He inherited the challenge of perfection. The step pyramid was a miracle, yes, but it was also a prototype, a vision half complete. Sneferu dreamed of something purer, simpler, and grander, a pyramid smooth as light, flawless in form, an eternal mountain born from human hands. At Medum, the attempt began. Builders extended the old step design, filling in the terraces to create the first true pyramid with flat sides. But stone has its secrets and ambition its price. As the structure rose, its outer layers shifted and cracked, sliding down in ruin. Today it stands broken, its core exposed, a monument to failure and to courage. Yet Sneferu did not falter. From the wreckage of Medum, he carried lessons north to the desert of Djoser, where red hills rolled like waves of time. There, the pharaoh commanded the building of 2 more pyramids. The first began at a steep angle, rising quickly toward the sun. But as the weight increased, the structure threatened to collapse. Imhotep's descendants, the engineers of the age, changed the angle midway, giving it the strange, elegant form we now call the bent pyramid. Its two slopes meet awkwardly yet beautifully, as if frozen between attempt and achievement. It is the geometry of learning carved into limestone. Sneferu's determination was not that of conquest, but of creation. He was not content to build monuments, he was building knowledge. And at last, near the end of his reign, his vision found its answer. A few miles away, the Red Pyramid rose from the desert, perfect in proportion, serene in simplicity. Its limestone casing shimmered in the sun, giving it a soft reddish glow that named it for eternity. For the first time, a pyramid stood complete, straight-sided, stable, and immense, its internal chambers arranged with mathematical grace. Sneferu had done what Djoser had only begun. He had turned faith into formula, transforming myth into engineering. The age of experimentation was over. The age of mastery had begun. The Red Pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a philosophy written in stone, a statement that eternity could be achieved through precision, not only prayer. Its alignment with the cardinal points of the compass, its proportions echoing the angles of sunlight and shadow, showed that Egypt had come to understand the universe as architecture. The pharaoh was no longer merely the son of the gods. He had become their collaborator. His architects, his laborers, his priests, all were part of a sacred order that bound heaven and earth in the logic of limestone. Inside, the burial chambers rose like inverted pyramids within, each vaulting upward as if the king's soul could ascend through stone itself. The silence there was absolute, broken only by the heartbeat of the earth. In that darkness, Sneferu's spirit was meant to rise and join Ra in his solar boat, sailing across the sky each day and through the underworld each night. The architecture mirrored theology, every block of verse in the hymns of creation. Outside, the desert flourished with life. Villages of workers surrounded the construction sites. Thousands of men and women who carved, hauled, and fitted each stone by hand. They were not slaves, as later myths would claim, but citizens working in rotation, their labor an offering to the gods and their king. They were fed, housed, and honored for their service. In their laughter and sweat, Egypt's unity lived. Every block laid was a covenant between ruler and people, between earth and sky. When Sneferu died, his monument stood like suns on the horizon. The Red Pyramid was his resting place, but it was also a torch passed forward. His son would inherit not only a kingdom, but an idea perfected. And that son would carry it farther than any before or after. In the years to come, his vision would rise again, larger, sharper, flawless, a shape so perfect that it would come to define Egypt itself. As twilight deepened over Djoser, the Red Pyramid glowed with a light of its own, reflecting the dying sun like a mirror of eternity. The sands whispered softly against its base, as if reciting a prayer learned long ago. And across the darkening river, the builders of tomorrow watched in silence, wondering, if perfection had been reached in stone, what remained to be conquered in the realm of the gods? The wind from the north carried the scent of limestone dust and the low murmur of thousands of voices. In the plateau beyond Memphis, a new kind of dawn began to rise, not of sun and sky, but of ambition. Sneferu's son Khufu stood before the quarries at Giza and saw what his father had achieved. The red pyramid glowed like frozen sunlight on the horizon, serene and flawless, a mountain shaped by will. But Khufu was not content to inherit perfection. He intended to surpass it. The divine order demanded nothing less. Under his reign, Egypt entered an age of brilliance and burden. The kingdom was rich, stable, and organized like a living machine. The scribes kept records of every harvest, every block, every man. The priests chanted the hymns of Ra from dawn to dusk, guiding the pharaoh's soul even while he still walked among them. And Khufu, whose name meant he protects me, saw himself as the earthly vessel of the sun god, not a ruler merely of men but of time itself. To honor Ra, to embody him, he would build the horizon where heaven and earth met. That horizon would be called Achet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, the Great Pyramid. The design defied belief. At Giza, the plateau rose above the Nile's floodplain, a sea of bedrock chosen not by chance but by genius. It would become the foundation for eternity. Khufu's architects, heirs to Imhotep's science, drew their plans with the precision of celestial geometry. The pyramid would rise more than 140 meters high, its sides aligned with the cardinal points to within fractions of a degree, its base vast enough to swallow a city square. More than 2 million blocks of stone would be cut, transported, and placed, each one a heartbeat in a colossal organism of order. From dawn to dusk, the quarrymen worked with rhythm more than noise. Wooden sleds groaned, ropes strained, water slicked the sand to ease the dragging of blocks. Overseers shouted commands in time with the pounding of copper chisels. Along the river, barges carried limestone from Tura, granite from Aswan, tools, food, and faith. The Nile was no longer just a river, it was an artery of empire. Villages swelled into cities of workers, artisans, carpenters, bakers, brewers, all bound to the rhythm of creation. Archaeologists thousands of years later would find their bakeries, their workshops, their graves. They would find bones healed from injury, signs of nourishment and care. These were not slaves, but citizens of purpose. They built as worship, and their labor became prayer. As the pyramid rose, Egypt's theology reached its zenith. The pharaoh was Ra's embodiment, and his monument was the sun's reflection on earth. Each stone, in its perfect alignment, mirrored the cosmic order of Ma'at. To disrupt the building was to invite chaos. Every worker, from the highest architect to the lowest hauler, understood this. The Great Pyramid was not simply a tomb. It was a cosmic machine, a ladder for the king's soul to ascend into the afterlife. Inside its hidden corridors, chambers aligned with the stars awaited the pharaoh's eternal journey. The shafts pointed toward Orion and the circumpolar stars, the imperishables that never set. Symbols of the soul's immortality. And yet beyond the grandeur there was quiet mystery. The pyramid's core remained solid, its chambers few, its purpose debated even now. Some see it as a tomb, others as a temple of rebirth, a mirror of heaven itself. Perhaps it was all these things or none. For Khufu, it was a declaration that human order could reflect divine perfection, that stone could capture the logic of light. When the last block was placed, the casing stones gleamed white under the sun, polished to a mirror sheen. The Great Pyramid shone so brightly that travelers could see it from miles across the desert. It was less a monument than a sunrise in stone. Its apex pointed directly to the heavens, and the priest declared that Ra himself descended upon it each dawn. Below its shadow, the smaller pyramids of the queens and the mastabas of courtiers formed a city of silence, all facing the same eternal summit. Khufu ruled from his palace at Memphis, but his spirit belonged to Giza. He visited the site often, they said, walking among the builders, watching the slow birth of forever. He was not loved by all. Ancient scribes whispered that he was stern, perhaps cruel, his rule heavy with order. Yet those same scribes wrote of his achievement as divine. Even centuries later, when its successors had turned to other gods, the Great Pyramid remained the axis of Egypt's memory. It was perfection realized and perfection feared. At sunset, when the desert cooled and the last light struck the white casing stones, the pyramid flared like fire, and its shadow stretched across the Nile toward the east, toward life, toward rebirth. To the people, it was proof that their pharaoh was more than mortal. He had joined the sun, his horizon eternal. But in the stillness after the light faded, the question lingered in every heart. If a man could build the horizon itself, what boundaries remained? Could even eternity contain the ambition that had turned dust to stone, silence to song? The wind moved softly across the plateau, whispering an answer that no one could hear. The age of wonder had only just begun. The plateau at Giza never sleeps. Even when the stars fade and the sky begins to pale, the air seems to tremble with the memory of hammers and voices. The Great Pyramid stands silent now, yet beneath its stillness lies the echo of 1,000 years of dreams. Khufu's monument had redefined what it meant to be divine. But the horizon of Egypt did not end there. His sons, his builders, and his priests all inherited a kingdom balanced on perfection, and perfection once achieved demands to be repeated. Khafre, son of Khufu, rose to the throne with the weight of the impossible upon him. To follow a god is to risk obscurity, but Khafre refused to live in another man's shadow. He looked to Giza, to the white mountain his father had raised, and decided that his own monument would not only rival it, but speak with a different voice. If Khufu's pyramid was the embodiment of pure geometry, Khafre's would be an echo of power and grace, a dialogue between heaven and stone. He chose his place carefully. His pyramid would stand slightly higher on the plateau, though smaller in size, so that from a distance it appeared equal. The illusion of parity achieved through wisdom, not mass. The base was cut from the bedrock, the lower layers formed of the mountain itself, as though the earth had risen in devotion. Around it, a vast funerary complex unfolded. Causeways, temples, statues, and altars, all aligned with the path of the sun. Khafre's architects had learned from Imhotep and Sneferu and Khufu, but they added something new: symmetry with soul. The valley temple at the base of his causeway remains one of Egypt's great miracles of preservation. Massive blocks of granite, each weighing tens of tons, fitted so precisely that not even a hair could slip between them. The floors were polished to a mirror's sheen, the walls lined with alabaster, cool and luminous in the half-light. It was here, perhaps, that priests anointed the pharaoh's body before his final journey to the pyramid, performing rites that bound the mortal to the divine. To walk through that temple was to pass from the human world into eternity. But Khafre's true legacy was not his pyramid nor his temples, but the guardian that still watches the desert today, the Great Sphinx. Carved directly from the limestone bedrock, the Sphinx was both statue and landscape, both question and answer. Its body, that of a lion, symbolized strength and the eternal vigilance of kingship. Its face, calm and enigmatic, was believed to bear the likeness of Khafre himself, fused with the sun god Ra. The name given to it by later generations was Hor-em-Akhet, Horus of the horizon, the god who gazes toward the dawn. The creation of the Sphinx marked a turning point in Egyptian imagination. For the first time, the divine was not distant in the heavens or hidden in the dark. It looked directly into the world, carved with human features. The pharaoh's face was now the face of the cosmos. To stand before the Sphinx at sunrise when its gaze catches the first light is to witness Egypt's faith made flesh, a union of earth, sky, and spirit that has never faded. Khafre's reign was one of stability and power. Trade flourished from Nubia to Byblos. Art reached a precision that mirrored the balance of his monuments. In workshops near Memphis, sculptors mastered the art of diorite, crafting statues of the king seated on his throne, falcon wings embracing his head. These statues were not portraits in the modern sense. They were vessels. The Egyptians believed the spirit of the king could inhabit them, receiving offerings and gazing eternally upon his people. In stone, Khafre lived on, serene and invulnerable. The workers of Giza, too, found immortality in their labor. Generations now grew up in the shadow of the pyramids, their lives bound to the rhythm of quarrying, carving, hauling. Children played among the half-buried stones, their laughter mingling with the wind that carried the scent of copper and sweat. Festivals celebrated the completion of each phase, music rising through the dust. Egypt was not just building monuments, it was building memory, and memory was the foundation of eternity. As Khafre's pyramid neared completion, it was clad in gleaming limestone, brighter even than his father's. At sunset, the two pyramids glowed like twin suns setting over the Nile, their shadows stretching across the desert in perfect alignment. The Sphinx watched silently between them, a bridge of stone between generations. In the end, Khafre did what few successors ever manage. He stood beside his father and did not disappear. His horizon joined Khufu's. His monuments spoke the same language, and together they transformed Giza from a royal necropolis into a map of heaven. The plateau became the mirror of the sky, each pyramid a constellation, each temple a star fixed in the architecture of time. When night fell and the stars emerged, their reflections seemed to rest on the pyramid's peaks, as if the gods themselves had descended to touch their creation. The Sphinx stared eastward, waiting for the next dawn, for the light that would once again reveal the face of man in the body of eternity. And as the wind whispered through the sands, Egypt held its breath, for the legacy of stone was not yet complete. Another ruler was watching the horizon, dreaming of the line between shadow and sun, wondering, if his father and grandfather had touched the heavens, what new realm remained to be claimed? The horizon of Giza burned each morning with gold, the desert alive with light that seemed almost divine. Beneath that brilliance, the Sphinx kept its patient vigil, its gaze locked eternally on the rising sun. To the people of the Nile, this was no mere statue. It was a promise. Each dawn that returned proved the world still held its balance, that the pharaoh's power endured beyond death. But even monuments age and time moves like wind across stone. After Khafra's reign, the perfection of Giza cast a shadow over his successors, a challenge that few dared to meet. Menkaure, Khafra's son, inherited not only the throne but the weight of legacy. Two mountains already pierced the horizon, his grandfather's vast pyramid and his father's shining twin. What then could a new king build in a world already filled with eternity? Menkaure chose not to outmatch them in size, but in spirit. His pyramid would be smaller, yes, but carved with grace and crafted with compassion, a monument to the human soul rather than divine grandeur. It would stand beside those of his ancestors not as a rival but as an echo softened by wisdom. At first light, the limestone of his pyramid glowed a soft rose, its lower courses sheathed in red granite from Aswan. The color of life and protection, it symbolized blood and vitality, the pulse of Ra's journey across the sky. The granite base was an innovation, a statement that strength did not need to be vast to be eternal. Menkaure's builders shaped each block with exquisite care, polishing the surface until it shimmered like water. The upper tiers of limestone caught the dawn's radiance, blending heaven and earth in gentle light. His was the most human of the Giza pyramids, modest yet profoundly harmonious. Nearby, 3 smaller pyramids rose for his queens, each one delicately aligned with his own. Together they formed a constellation of devotion, husband, wives, and the divine order that bound them. Around them stretched temples and causeways decorated with intricate reliefs of offerings and ceremonies. Unlike the stark, austere grandeur of his predecessors, Menkaure's art breathed with tenderness. Figures of workers, priests, and family were carved not as symbols, but as living beings, each face distinct, each gesture deliberate. In these stones, the Egyptians began to celebrate individuality as part of eternity. Archaeologists would one day find statues buried in the Valley Temple, Menkaure and his queen standing side by side. Their bodies, carved from dark gray schist, gleamed like night against the pale desert. The king's stance was firm, his left foot forward in eternal motion, the queen's hand resting gently on his arm. Her gesture is both support and affection, a union of strength and grace. Their eyes gaze ahead with calm assurance, neither distant nor cold, but alive with quiet certainty. In their stillness, the ideal of kingship reached its most human expression. Menkaure's reign, though shorter than his father's, shone with justice and balance. The ancient storytellers spoke of him as merciful, a king who listened to his people and tempered law with kindness. Whether legend or truth, the sentiment lingered through centuries. In an age obsessed with divine order, Menkaure reminded Egypt that compassion too was sacred. He restored temples, reformed rituals, and ensured that offerings to the gods continued even in times of scarcity. To the priests of Ra and Hathor, he was the embodiment of Mat, truth in harmony. Yet his death came suddenly, and his pyramid remained unfinished when the end arrived. The final casing stones were left rough, the mortuary temple incomplete. But his queen, the same who stands beside him in stone, ensured his burial and continued the rituals in his name. To the Egyptians, an unfinished monument did not signify failure, it signified continuity, that the journey never truly ended. In their belief, the king had simply stepped beyond the horizon to join his ancestors in the celestial fields. Time, ever patient, began to erode the brilliance of Giza. The limestone sheathing loosened, the temples fell into ruin, sand crept up the sides of the pyramids like slow waves. Yet the triad of kings, Khufu, Khafra, Menkaure, endured as the axis of Egypt's memory. Together they formed a trinity of aspiration. The architect of order, the guardian of power, the ruler of compassion. Giza was not just a cemetery, it was a map of heaven laid upon the earth. And though centuries would pass, their legacy became more than physical. The Egyptians learned from these kings that stone was not the only path to immortality. Ritual, language, and story could also defy death. In the temples and schools of scribes, young men practiced writing hymns and royal annals, preserving names against the desert wind. The art of remembrance had begun to outgrow the monuments themselves. As twilight fell over the pyramids, the Sphinx cast its long shadow once more, stretching across the sands toward the river. The sky turned the color of copper, and for a fleeting moment the three pyramids glowed as if relit from within. The wind whispered softly through the stones, carrying a truth the builders must have known all along, that no monument, however vast, could hold eternity alone. Only memory could. And so Egypt continued, its heart beating with the rhythm of the Nile, its gaze fixed on the horizon. But beyond Giza, beyond the plateau of kings, another city was stirring. A new dynasty preparing to rise, carrying the ancient dream forward. What would happen when Egypt turned its eyes away from the West, from death, and toward the living gods of the sun? The sun rose slowly over the Nile, its light spilling across the eastern sky like molten gold. The pyramids of Giza glowed faintly in the distance, their peaks catching the first fire of day. But the pulse of Egypt had already begun to move elsewhere. To the south, in the vast sweep of the river valley, a new city had awakened, one devoted not only to kings but to gods who lived among men. The old kingdom was nearing its height, and Egypt itself had become a reflection of the cosmos, ordered, luminous, eternal. In the royal court at Memphis, the pharaoh no longer ruled by mere inheritance. He ruled as the sun's embodiment. The title Son of Ra had become part of the royal name, a declaration that kingship was not simply divine favor but divine identity. The line between man and God had dissolved in the glare of the noonday sun. The priests of Hierakonpolis, city of the sun, grew in power, shaping theology into architecture and architecture into meaning. They taught that Ra was born anew each morning from the eastern horizon, traveled across the sky, and descended into the underworld each night to battle chaos before returning at dawn. Life itself became this cycle, a promise of death and rebirth, of light forever conquering darkness. Under Pharaoh Djoser, founder of the 5th dynasty, this vision took form. The great pyramids had already fulfilled their purpose. They had reached heaven. Now the focus shifted from tomb to temple, from silence to song. Djoser built a new kind of monument, not for his body but for the sun. On the edge of the desert near Abu Sur, a temple was raised, open to the sky, its altar set to catch the first rays of dawn. Here priests performed daily rituals to Ra, offering incense, wine, and hymns that described the sunrise as creation itself repeated. The sun temples became Egypt's new cathedrals, places where the divine cycle was not imagined but enacted. The architecture changed with this theology. The pyramids of the Fifth Dynasty, smaller and less imposing, gave way to artistry and text. The interiors of tombs and temples bloomed with carvings and inscriptions, stars etched into ceilings, hieroglyphs running like rivers across the walls. The first pyramid texts appeared during the reign of Unas, the last king of the dynasty, carved deep within his pyramid at Saqqara. These were not mere decorations. They were incantations, roadmaps for the soul's ascent to the heavens. The words themselves shimmered with poetry. O Unas, rise upon your iron bones and bronze flesh, ascend to the sky among the stars. Each spell guided the pharaoh through the perils of the afterlife. Across waters of fire, past serpents and darkness, into the embrace of Ra. For the first time, eternity had a language, and that language was written in stone. The priests chanted these texts as the body of the king was laid to rest, their voices echoing through the narrow chambers, merging the mortal with the cosmic. But while theology reached new heights, the weight of empire pressed hard upon the people. Maintaining the temples, feeding the priests, and sustaining the bureaucracy demanded more than devotion. The vast machine of Egypt, built on abundance, began to strain under its own perfection. The floods of the Nile, once predictable, faltered. The harvests grew uncertain. Yet the rituals did not cease. Each dawn, priests climbed the temple ramps, their white robes glowing against the red sky, lifting their arms to praise the sun. Even in hardship, faith endured, for to abandon it was to let chaos win. Art in this age became luminous. Walls came alive with color, ochre, lapis, gold leaf pressed into carvings of kings, gods, and stars. Scenes of offering and renewal covered every surface, as though the Egyptians feared that even a blank wall could invite darkness. Sculptors captured movement with subtle grace. A lotus opening, a falcon in flight, the curve of a priest's hand pouring libation. Through art, Egypt continued to affirm what it had always believed, that beauty was order, and order was divine. In Heliopolis, the high priests charted the heavens. They tracked the rising of Sirius, the star that heralded the flood, and from its rhythm they refined the calendar to match the solar year. Days, months, and seasons became instruments of precision. Time itself was now measured in worship. The temple obelisks, tall and slender, pointed toward the zenith where Ra's light fell most pure. Their tips, gilded with electrum, blazed each morning as if set aflame by the god's own touch. The pharaohs of the Fifth Dynasty understood that monuments alone could not sustain eternity. Words, rituals, and faith were stronger than stone. The power that had once been carved into the earth now flowed in ink and breath. The king was not only the ruler of Egypt, but its high priest, his daily duty to maintain the rising of the sun. The state and the cosmos had become one body. Yet even as the temples glittered and the hymns of Ra filled the air, a shadow began to lengthen over the horizon. The wealth that fed the priests and adorned the gods was drawn from the people, and beneath the gold and hymns murmurs began to stir. Small, uncertain, but growing, Egypt had built its heaven upon earth, but heaven demanded a price. As the sun sank into the western desert, the obelisks of Heliopolis caught the final light and burned like torches. The priests bowed in reverence, whispering prayers of renewal. But the Nile, dark and low beneath the fading glow, carried a different song, slow, patient, and foreboding. How long could the rhythm of faith sustain the weight of empire? How long could light hold back the hunger of the night? The Nile ran sluggish and low that year. The fields along its banks, once rich with barley and flax, cracked under the sun's weight. The people prayed to the river as they always had, but its answer came in silence. Drought had found Egypt, and with it came something more dangerous than hunger: doubt. For centuries, the pharaoh had stood as the living link between gods and men, his rituals ensuring the rising of the sun and the flooding of the river. But now, when the waters failed, eyes turned not to heaven but toward the throne. Faith, like the flood, had begun to recede. The old kingdom, that glittering age of stone and sunlight, was entering its twilight. The great pyramids still gleamed beneath the desert sky, but their builders were gone, their line weakened by time and division. The priests of Hierakonpolis, guardians of the sun cult, had grown powerful enough to rival the kings they once served. They controlled the temples, the granaries, the rituals that kept Egypt's heart beating. Their prayers were as binding as decrees, their wealth carved from the offerings of generations. The balance between crown and temple, once the foundation of Mat, divine order, had begun to tilt. Pharaoh Pepi II came to the throne as a child and ruled longer than any king before him, more than 90 years. His reign began in light and ended in shadow. When he first wore the white crown of Upper Egypt, the priests sang that he was Ra reborn, a child of dawn. But by the time his body had aged beyond memory, the temples no longer echoed with those hymns. The old man on the throne was a relic of a world that had forgotten why it worshipped. In the early years of his reign, Egypt had still prospered. Expeditions ventured south into Nubia, bringing back gold, ivory, and exotic animals. Merchants sailed to the land of Punt for incense and resin. The state was vast, orderly, and proud. But slowly the rhythm faltered. Local governors, the nomarchs, who once ruled in the pharaoh's name, began to act as kings within their provinces. Their tombs grew as grand as those of the monarch's court, their names carved as boldly as royal cartouches. Power was fracturing like dry clay. The people of Egypt felt the shift in ways too small to record. In empty granaries, in temples that fell into disrepair, in taxes that no longer brought protection. When famine struck, the old rituals failed to soothe. The gods, it seemed, had turned their faces away. Priests recited the hymns of Ra at dawn, but their words fell like dust on the wind. For the first time in memory, chaos, Isfet, began to whisper through the cracks of empire. Poems and laments from the age speak with aching honesty. They describe a world inverted, the poor rich with plunder, the noble fallen, the river turned to blood. The great man groans, one inscription says, and the lowly laughs. The language of lament replaced the language of praise. It was not rebellion in arms, but in spirit, a quiet undoing of faith. The pyramid builders' descendants no longer raised monuments for kings. They built for themselves, for their families, for the gods who might still listen. The collective dream of eternity had scattered into 1,000 private prayers. And yet, even in decline, Egypt's brilliance did not vanish. In tombs carved into the cliffs of Aswan and Beni Hassan, Artisans painted scenes of daily life with tenderness unmatched by the grandeur of earlier ages. Musicians, dancers, boatmen, lovers. The art of the heart replaced the art of the throne. The focus turned inward toward the human soul. It was as if Egypt, tired from centuries of divine perfection, had paused to remember its own humanity. Pepi II's long reign ended in silence. When he died, there was no single Egypt left to bury him. His pyramid at Saqqara stood small and pale beside the giants of his ancestors. Its inner walls still etched with the ancient spells of ascent. But no procession of thousands came to mourn. No new monuments rose in his honor. The Nile kept flowing indifferent, carrying fragments of a broken age toward the sea. The world had changed. The old order of divine kingship had cracked beneath the weight of time. The priests could not command the floods, and the pharaoh could no longer command the priests. Across the land, local lords gathered their own armies, issued their own decrees. Egypt, once a single breath, had become a chorus of voices, each singing its own hymn to survival. The people still prayed at sunrise, still watched the horizon for Ra's return, but the light felt colder now. The obelisks of Heliopolis still caught the dawn, but fewer offerings burned at their base. A silence deeper than drought settled over the two lands. The silence before change. And yet in the heart of that silence, something stirred. From the chaos of division, new ideas were taking root. Visions of justice, of personal faith, of gods who listen not only to kings but to the humble. The empire had fallen, but Egypt itself was not dead. It was dreaming of renewal, of balance restored. The question that lingered across the fading light was not whether Egypt would rise again, but who would have the strength or the wisdom to call the sun back from darkness. Darkness had fallen, but it was not the night. It was an age. The pyramids, once white as dawn, now stood gray against a horizon heavy with silence. Sand gathered in their corners, wind whispered through their corridors, and no priests came to light incense at their gates. The old kingdom, the age of divine order, had ended, leaving behind a landscape of memory and ruin. Egypt had entered what its later poets would call the time of shadows, when every man was his own king and the gods seemed far away. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Nile ran through a land without unity. Local lords, the nomarchs who had once sworn allegiance to Pharaoh, now ruled from their provincial seats, raising armies, building tombs, and claiming the loyalty of their own people. The power that had once flowed like the river now split into 100 smaller streams. Some regions prospered, others starved. Trade faltered. Caravans that had once carried incense and gold returned empty. Temples fell quiet. The bureaucracy that had managed the rhythm of Egypt's life dissolved, and with it the illusion of permanence. But from this fracture came something unexpected. Freedom. Without the weight of a distant monarch or the hierarchy of great temples, local communities began to shape their own destinies. In small towns along the Nile, scribes copied old hymns and reinterpreted them for new ears. Artisans painted not for pharaohs but for neighbors. Farmers built modest chapels beside their fields and prayed directly to the gods of their choosing. Religion, once centralized in the figure of the king, began to turn inward. The divine was no longer unreachable. It was personal, immanent, reflected in the faces of ordinary people. From this period comes one of Egypt's most haunting voices, The Man Who Was Tired of Life, a dialogue written on papyrus, part poem, part prayer. To whom can I speak today? He asks. The gentle have perished and the violent rule. It is the cry of a soul searching for meaning in a world that had forgotten its balance. Yet within that cry there is also awakening. The writer does not curse the gods, he questions them. He speaks as one equal in despair, demanding understanding rather than favor. Out of chaos, introspection was born. The Middle Kingdom, Egypt's second great age, was still generations away, but its seeds were germinating in this soil of uncertainty. Small rulers along the river began to rebuild their towns, reopening canals, restoring shrines, rekindling faith in order. One such place was Thebes, a southern city of quiet strength, surrounded by fertile plains and guarded by cliffs. Its local lords, though modest in power, carried within them the old memory of unity. They still prayed to Amun, a hidden god of air and breath whose name meant the invisible. In his mystery lay hope. While the north remained fractured, Thebes grew. The families who ruled there built tombs in the western hills, decorated with scenes not of conquest but of life, banquets, hunting, music. Their art spoke of endurance, of finding beauty in survival. The priests of Amun preached that the god was not confined to the temple or the throne. He was everywhere, unseen but ever present. In that belief, the people found resilience. The unseen god became the whisper behind every sunrise, every harvest, every sigh of the wind. Meanwhile, the stories of the past lived on, retold by storytellers and scribes who refused to let memory die. They spoke of Khufu and Djoser, of pyramids gleaming like suns, of kings who walked with gods. These tales were not nostalgia, they were instruction. They reminded the people of what had been and of what could be again. The Egyptians had always believed that the world was cyclical, that decay was only the prelude to rebirth. Just as Ra sank into darkness each night to rise anew, so too would Egypt. In the tombs of local nobles, inscriptions began to change. No longer did they simply declare lineage or wealth. They spoke of virtue, of honesty, fairness, generosity. I gave bread to the hungry, one reads. I gave water to the thirsty. I was a shelter for the weary. These words mark a profound shift. Morality had become personal. The maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic balance, was no longer the sole duty of kings. It belonged to everyone. The Nile, faithful as ever, continued to flow through the chaos, washing the past and feeding the present. Each flood, though uncertain, carried renewal. The people looked to its return as a sign that the gods had not abandoned them. And when the waters finally rose high and strong again, the old faith stirred. The desert might devour kingdoms, but it could not erase belief. As dusk deepened across the two lands, fires flickered in the villages along the river. The songs sung beside those flames were no longer hymns to a pharaoh, but to the endurance of the heart. Egypt, stripped of its grandeur, was rediscovering its soul. The voice that had once spoken only through monuments now whispered through common tongues, through small acts of kindness, through stories told beneath the stars. And somewhere in Thebes, as the river shimmered beneath the moon, a young prince looked northward toward the ruins of Memphis and Giza and felt the stir of destiny. The gods were silent, but the silence was not empty. It was waiting for a new sun to rise, for a new kingdom to restore what had been lost. Egypt, as it had always done, was preparing to be reborn. The dawn over Thebes broke like a quiet revelation. Pale light spilling down from the cliffs of the west, shimmering on the waters of the Nile. It was a different Egypt now, humble and scarred, yet alive. The fields were green again, the floods had returned, and the people began to remember what unity had once felt like. From the ruins of the old kingdom's perfection rose the slow, deliberate rhythm of renewal. It began not with kings, but with builders, priests, and farmers who refused to forget. Out of the silence of the time of shadows, the Middle Kingdom began to take form. At Thebes, a man named Intef gathered the threads of power. He was not a pharaoh by birth, but a governor, a nomarch, ruler of a single stretch of fertile valley. Yet his faith in order was unshakable. He claimed descent from ancient kings and called upon the gods to witness his devotion to Mayat, the balance that had once kept the world whole. Around him, the priests of Amun whispered of destiny. Thebes, they said, was chosen, its god invisible but omnipresent, its people strong of heart. While the north still quarreled and fragmented, Thebes began to build again. Temples rose, modest but filled with song. The banners of Amun fluttered in the dawn wind, and with each passing season the dream of unity felt less like memory and more like prophecy. When Intef died, his sons carried the vision forward. They called themselves kings, not merely governors, and buried their fathers in grand tombs at El Tarif, where the cliffs met the desert. The tombs were carved deep into the rock, painted with scenes of boats gliding down the river. Herds of cattle, dancers, and musicians. It was as if the people, weary of stone mountains that reached for heaven, had turned their art inward into the heart of the earth. The tombs whispered of gratitude, for sunlight, for bread, for the Nile's return. The gods had not abandoned them after all. They had only taught patience. The Theban kings ruled not through conquest at first, but through compassion and endurance. Their soldiers defended the south, their scribes restored records, their priests renewed the calendar and festivals. Across the land, the name of Amun began to spread, the hidden one, the unseen creator who breathed life into all things. His temples became sanctuaries of hope, and his image, a plumed crown rising from a human form, stood for the promise that what was invisible could still be real. Meanwhile, far to the north, another line of rulers held sway. The kings of Hierakonpolis, proud and wary, who claimed descent from the old dynasties of Memphis. Between Thebes and Hierakonpolis, the river carried tension. Each city saw itself as Egypt's rightful heart. Skirmishes flared, alliances formed and failed. Yet even in conflict, both sides shared the same longing. To restore the two lands, to mend what time had broken. The struggle for unity was no longer the pride of empires, it was an act of faith. Out of this long contest emerged one of the most remarkable rulers of Egypt's story. Mentuhotep II. His reign would become the bridge between darkness and dawn. A Theban by birth, he inherited a divided nation and a weary people. He did not march to war in arrogance but in duty, believing that restoring order was service to the gods themselves. Year by year he pushed northward, reclaiming lost provinces not through annihilation but through absorption. His armies carried not just weapons but priests and scribes, offering renewal to those who joined him. When at last Hierakonpolis fell, and the banners of Thebes flew from the delta to the first cataract, Egypt was whole again. Mentuhotep stood in the temple of Amun, clothed in white linen, and raised his arms to the morning sun. The hymn spoke his name with reverence, calling him He who unites the two lands. For the first time in centuries, the river's length was ruled by one heart. His burial place at Deir el-Bahari was unlike any before it, half tomb, half temple, carved into the cliffs that face the rising sun. A grand causeway led from the valley to terraces of stone colonnades framing the sky. It was both monument and meditation, a place where death met resurrection. Pilgrims came from across Egypt to stand before its walls and feel the return of Maat. The temple did not pierce heaven like the pyramids of old. Instead, it embraced the earth, blending with the mountains as if born from them. Eternity, it seemed, no longer needed to reach upward. It could rest in balance. Under Mentuhotep, Egypt remembered itself. Trade flowed once more. The arts flourished. Faith regained its warmth. The poems of this age speak of gratitude, not grandeur. The land is united, one hymn declares. The river flows, the hearts of men are one. The pharaoh's name became synonymous with rebirth, his temple a symbol of the horizon restored. And yet, as always in Egypt's long rhythm, the question lingered in the stillness of dusk. Could order endure where ambition breathes? Unity had returned, but the seeds of power and faith were already entwined again, growing together toward a future neither priests nor kings could foresee. As the evening sun sank behind Mentuhotep's cliffs, the light turned the stone to blood-red fire, and the shadows stretched across the valley like hands reaching for the next age. An age that would chase perfection once more and pay its price. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahari glowed like embers at dusk, their stone faces streaked with shadow and light. From the terraces of Mentuhotep's temple, the Nile could be seen winding through the valley, a silver serpent breathing life into the land. The priests still sang his name at sunrise, calling him the restorer of order, the king who healed the two lands. But even restoration carries its own burden. When peace is won, the question that follows is always the same: how to keep it. Mentuhotep's successors inherited a kingdom renewed but fragile. The unity he had forged through devotion and patience needed structure, law, and the machinery of governance. The Middle Kingdom was born from this need, an era not of conquest but of consolidation. Pharaohs now ruled as stewards of Maat, protectors of justice, servants of the divine cycle. Their ambition was tempered by wisdom, their power measured by harmony. And from this equilibrium arose a vision of Egypt not as empire but as eternal order, a world made whole through the discipline of compassion. The new capital moved north again, to a place called Ichtawi, near modern Lisht, where the river branched toward the Fayum oasis. It was a city built between waters and desert, a symbol of balance in geography and in rule. Here the pharaoh Amenemhat I began his reign, a man of both intellect and iron. He was no royal heir, but a commoner risen through the ranks, a soldier who understood both the fragility and the necessity of power. To secure his throne, he established co-regency with his son Senusret, ensuring that stability would outlive him. To secure Egypt itself, he fortified its borders, reopened its quarries, and revived its economy. The arts flourished again. Sculptors returned to their chisels with reverence, shaping kings not as distant gods, but as human figures suffused with calm authority. Their faces bore the marks of thought and age, the lines of rulers who understood endurance more than glory. The temples of the Middle Kingdom were smaller than those of old, yet their inscriptions reached deeper. They spoke of Maat as a living force, a truth that every person, not just Pharaoh, was responsible to uphold. From this age comes one of Egypt's most enduring voices. The Instruction of Amenemhat, a work of political wisdom and quiet melancholy. Written in the voice of the murdered king addressing his son, it warns of betrayal and impermanence. Trust not a brother, the ghostly Pharaoh advises, no, not a friend. Yet beneath its caution lies a deeper truth, that even kings are mortal and power survives only through duty, not desire. It is Egypt's first philosophy of governance, the poetry of realism carved into papyrus. Senusret G, the son who succeeded him, carried that wisdom forward. He was both warrior and builder, leading campaigns into Nubia and bringing back gold, granite, and captives. But unlike the conquering kings of earlier times, Senusret's victories were framed not as domination but as renewal. He extended Egypt's boundaries to protect its heart, not to feed its pride. In his temples, the god Amun rose to prominence, merging with Ra into Amun-Ra, the hidden and the visible united. The king's role was to keep those dualities in balance, to ensure that the seen world reflected the unseen. It was Senusret who began one of Egypt's most beautiful sanctuaries, the temple at Karnak, on the east bank of Thebes. What began as a modest shrine would, over centuries, grow into the greatest complex of devotion the world has ever known. In its open courts and forest of columns, the people would one day gather to watch the light of dawn fall perfectly through its gates on the morning of the solstice. The alignment was no accident. It was a dialogue between architecture and eternity. A promise that as long as the sun rose, so too would Egypt. The literature of this era reached a depth unknown before. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor told of a man who, lost at sea, found wisdom in the mouth of a speaking serpent. The story of Sinuhe followed an exile's longing for home, his journey through fear and redemption. These were not hymns to kings, but reflections on the human soul, its courage, its frailty, its endless search for belonging. Egypt had learned that immortality was not only for the divine, but also for words. Beneath the surface of prosperity, however, change stirred again. Wealth concentrated in the temples, power coiled in the priesthood, and the borders beyond the first cataract whispered of restlessness. The kingdom that had found harmony would soon learn how delicate harmony can be. Yet for now, under the light of Senusret's reign, Egypt glowed like the river at sunrise, calm, luminous, utterly self-assured. At night, as the stars shimmered over Karnak and the breeze carried the scent of lotus and incense, a sense of peace filled the air. It was not the peace of stillness, but of balance, a peace that knew motion like the river's eternal flow. The priests whispered prayers to Amun-Ra, the hidden and revealed, and the pharaohs slept beneath their invocations, dreaming of the next dawn. But even the most perfect dawn casts a shadow. The empire's breath was steady, yet the world beyond its borders was changing. To the east, across the sands of Sinai, new peoples were stirring, traders, wanderers, and warriors whose names Egypt did not yet know. The Nile had always been Egypt's shield, but no wall of water could keep the future from arriving. What happens, the gods must have wondered, when the river that gives life also carries strangers to its shore? The Nile glimmered under the last stars before dawn, its surface quiet, deceptive, reflecting the deep indigo of the sky. The temples of Karnak and Luxor still slept, their pylons dark silhouettes against the eastern horizon. In the hush, only the slow murmur of water and wind moved through the reeds. Egypt's heart beat steadily, but it beat toward change. For centuries, the river had carried light, order, and kingship from one age to the next. Now it would carry something new, uncertainty and the weight of the world beyond its borders. Under the later kings of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt reached its golden maturity. Trade stretched from the Levant to Nubia, diplomacy and artistry intertwined like the reeds in the flood. Pharaohs such as Senusret III had ruled with precision, their faces carved in stone with eyes that seemed to see both past and future. His was a reign of discipline and expansion. Canals cut through the cataracts of Nubia, fortresses rose along the southern border, and the frontiers were guarded not by pride, but by vigilance. The Middle Kingdom's architects refined the language of limestone and granite until it sang. Every temple and tomb was a prayer rendered permanent. Yet in that perfection lay the seeds of its undoing. The bureaucracy, so efficient, grew heavy with its own success. The temples, so devoted, amassed wealth beyond measure. And the kings, in their quest for balance, began to withdraw into distance, their divinity again separating them from the people they served. As centuries passed, the rhythm slowed, and the faith that had once burned like gold began to cool into routine. The rituals still rose with the sun, but their meaning thinned with repetition. Far to the east, across the shifting deserts of Sinai, caravans began to arrive. Small at first, then many. They came with cattle, copper, and stories of lands beyond Egypt's imagination. Among them were strangers with beards and cloaks, speaking languages unknown to the Nile's ears. They were traders, migrants, perhaps refugees, people the Egyptians would call the Amu, the Asiatics. To the Egyptians, they were both fascination and fear. Outsiders who brought goods and ideas, but also change, the one thing the river never desired. In time, some of these strangers settled in the delta, working the fields, trading in the markets, marrying into Egyptian families. They learned the tongue of the land, worshipped its gods, and built their own shrines to Baal and Set, gods of storm and strength. But with the slow rise of their numbers came a subtle shift of power. The Nile's mouth, once the quiet edge of empire, became restless. Egypt, confident in its timeless order, did not yet see that the world was knocking at its gates. Meanwhile, deep in Thebes, the priests of Amun had grown immense in influence. Their god, once the hidden breath of creation, now commanded more temples than any other. Offerings poured into their coffers, their words carried weight equal to the king's. The divine and the political had fused once again, as they always did in Egypt's endless cycle. The pharaohs ruled in name, but Amun ruled in spirit. Faith, so often Egypt's salvation, began to tighten like a noose. The twilight of the Middle Kingdom came quietly, not with invasion or collapse, but with exhaustion. The last kings of the 12th dynasty watched as the flood's rhythm faltered again, as border garrisons weakened, as trade withered into rumor. The pyramids they built at Djoser and El Lahun were small, yet filled with elegance. Texts and charms to protect the dead, hymns etched like veins of gold across the walls. They no longer sought to challenge the heavens. Their monuments were prayers for endurance, not conquest. And still, the river flowed. It carried with it the silt of empires, the dust of priests, the laughter of children along its banks. The spirit of Egypt had endured drought and darkness before. It would endure again. The people had learned that the divine was not only in stone but in the act of living, in the hand that sows seed, the heart that keeps faith, the voice that sings at sunrise. But far beyond the desert, storms gathered. In the Levant and across the Red Sea, kingdoms rose and fell, and migrations began that would one day reach the delta like a flood not of water but of men. The Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands, were coming, though Egypt did not yet know their name. Their arrival would end the calm of centuries and plunge the two lands into a new reckoning. As dawn finally broke, the first light struck the pylons of Karnak, and the priests of Amun stepped out to greet the sun. They raised their arms and chanted the same words their ancestors had spoken for 1,000 years. The golden light poured across the Nile, across the tombs of Mentuhotep and Senusret, across the pyramids of Lisht and the faraway ghosts of Giza. Egypt stood bathed in its eternal glow, ageless and beautiful, unaware that another darkness was already stirring beyond its horizons. The wind carried the sound of the river, the same song it had always sung, the song of life unending. And as the light climbed higher, washing the temples in gold, one could almost hear the question whispered through time itself. How many times can a civilization be reborn before it becomes immortal? Or before it forgets what it means to be human? And so, across 5,000 years of wind and silence, the Nile still flows, patient, eternal, whispering the same story it has always told. From Hierakonpolis to Abydos, from Saqqara to Giza, from Thebes to Karnak, Egypt's memory endures not in ruins but in rhythm. The rhythm of those who dreamed that stone could hold the sky, that order could conquer chaos, and that faith could outlast time itself. The journey we have walked together is not merely the story of kings and gods, but of humanity, of people who built, who believed, who fell, and who rose again and again. If you have listened this far, if you have drifted with us down the river of ages and felt the pulse of the ancient sun, then you too have touched the spirit that Egypt never lost. The quiet courage to seek eternity in the fleeting. Thank you for walking this long road through dust, light, and memory. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade into silence. Subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts so that the echoes of history continue to reach new hearts. This is the Cryptic Realm channel, where forgotten worlds awaken and the past still breathes.